She studied landscape architecture at UC Davis and has done everything from park planning for municipal agencies and recreational resource planning to habitat restoration and land planning. Upon her retirement, she became a master gardener and permaculture designer, and she has certifications including Life in the Soil through Elaine Ingram, Rescape Green Gardener, Firewise Landscaping, Qualified Water Efficient Landscaper, and G3 Watershed Wise Landscape Professional. So we're excited to have her share her knowledge with us today. So please welcome Kit Veerkamp.
Great. Well, go from here then. And let me get on and share my screen. And away we go. Okay. This is going to be fast-paced, and I will, when I hold my finger up, it's because I've been notified that my connection is unstable. Anyway, hopefully it will improve. But anyway, I will pause when I do that and try to just make sure I've covered everything so that you get it. Anyway, this class is called Turning Dirt into Gold. And I hope to take you through the process of understanding the soil food web and how you can make this wonderful system that's in the soil work for you in terms of managing not only the health of your plants, but really being able to reduce your water usage. It goes hand in hand, and especially because we are so drought challenged again, and it will probably not be getting much better over time given climate change, that this is something to keep in mind and to implement some of these practices that I'm going to discuss. So for some important resources that I really recommend, that if you want to know more about what I'm going to be talking about today, the USDA, if you Google USDA soil food web, you will come up with this fabulous resources, a lot of which is covered here in much briefer coverage. So, and then these three books, Secrets of the Soil, The Soul of the Soil, and Life in the Soil, are all written for the layperson, for the home gardener. And these are great resources as well. Everything we grow in our yards, whether it's traditional landscape plants or our vegetable gardens, and even out in nature around us, everything starts with the soil, and soil health affects how you are able to manage all of that. And that whole topsoil formation, differentiate between dirt and soil. Dirt is simply the minerals in the soil, whereas soil itself contains just a whole lot more, as you're going to see. And so that topsoil formation occurs essentially when all living matter on top of the soil gets decomposed and incorporated into the soil itself, and then it becomes, that dirt becomes soil. And our soil provides a tremendous number of ecosystem services that enable not only us, but all life to live on this planet. So in talking about soils, most of us are aware of this concept of topsoil versus everything that's down under. And generally our topsoil is not very thick. If you're lucky, you might have 6 to 8 inches of topsoil on top of the subsoil layers. It just depends on where you're located. And then there's the organic matter, which is a very thin layer on top of the topsoil that then gets incorporated down by soil organisms. So all of us really want to have more topsoil, and even go so far as to purchase it sometimes if you don't have what you consider to be topsoil. But really that's not necessary, and you can make some big differences in what you have by incorporated more organic matter, and I'll be talking more about that. So what is soil in general? Well, it's made up, I've mentioned it's your minerals, which often people refer to as dirt, which is weathered rock, that has been broken down into various particle sizes. And then 50% of your soil is actually comprised of air and water. And another, if you're really lucky, 5% is a nice rich soil. Most of us in this region are lucky to have 1 to 2% organic matter in the soil. And air and water really do play a very important role. They fill the voids between all these grains of minerals. And it's the way water moves through the soil, both gravitationally, going down, and then capillary action moves it through, around, and even up into between these particles, and allowing roots to absorb that moisture. And the water movement helps push stale air out of these spaces, and so bringing in fresh air to replace that. The soil compaction, though, can reduce this place, and when that happens, you're also reducing the amount of space for air and water, and also for root growth. The little bit of remaining, there's always just this minuscule amount of water remaining in the soil that is chemically adhered to the soil part, or to mineral particles, that is not available to plant roots. So the fact that it's there really doesn't do any good. Now, in terms of talking about particle size, oftentimes we talk about having clay soils or silty soils, sandy soils, and this is where you can see from this graphic the relative size of those particles. We can see gravel, sand, and a little bit of silt, and silt itself is very dusty. You can blow it, and it's all over the place. Clay isn't even visible without a microscope. And then we've got our soil structure. So you've got texture and structure. Structure is the arrangement of the soil particles. And as you can see from this photo here, it arranges itself very differently, and a lot of it has to do with the soil organisms and the amount of organic matter in your soil. And what's preferable is the granular. That's much easier to dig in, much easier to move around, and much easier for plants for the roots to get out. And as soils become more massive or blocky, that compaction, or that inability it makes it much more difficult for roots to penetrate those and move through and develop a really rich root system. So again, that soil structure affects not only the roots moving through it, but it also affects the drainage and ability for water to move through that soil, which then again affects oil circulation. And it also provides space for soil organisms to live. So a really good soil structure, as mentioned in one of the pictures, is granular and more easily broken up, but it resists erosion and it resists drying. And nutrient retention is high in a good soil structure. And we'll see in a bit why that is, and it's due to soil organisms. Whereas poor soil structure holds very little water. It's dry all the time. You feel like you're having to water nearly every day or every other day. There's not a lot of air through the roots or the organisms. And because of that, nutrients get locked up and not accessible. And this oftentimes, that the frustration of that leads people to overwater and over-fertilize. Now, it's really important on a number of levels to understand what your soil texture is, and that's because it affects how much water you should be applying to your soils. Your soils can only handle so much water before it starts to either run off, or it's just moving through the soil so fast that you're wasting it. I'm not going to go into the details about the jar test. I urge you to Google that, because there's all kinds of instructions out there on doing the jar test if you don't want to send out for have your soil analyzed by a lab. But it involves collecting soil, putting in a jar with some detergent, shaking it up, and then watching it settle out. And once it does settle out, you'll see layers in the jar. And then you measure that, and then you come to a chart similar to this one. And by the percentages, it'll tell you where your soils, which category they fall into. Now, if you wanted to make it even easier for yourselves, just go to the NRCS Web Soil Survey page, put in your address, and it will give you it'll give you a readout. It'll tell you exactly what type of soil you have. And you may have this, in this particular photo, this is my property, covers my property. I've got 3 different soil types, but what it boils down to is, for the most part, I have silty loams on my property. So that makes it really easy, because again, it affects how you manage your soils, but especially how you manage your irrigation. Now, many of you, if you've been gardening for some time, have heard the term tilthy soils. It's a goal that we all have to have tilthy soils, because that means that you have a combination of all of these different characteristics that combined make soils easy to work and generally are healthy for growing plant materials of any type. It's the composition, it's a combination of structure, texture, and then the density and drainage and water holding capacity. So one of the things, besides knowing what type of soil you have, one of the things you really want to know about your soil is how well does it drain. And so digging a hole, filling it with water, and then measuring how long it takes that hole to drain is very informational for you, again, in terms of plant health that can, and informing an efficient irrigation schedule and application rate for you. If water is standing in these holes for hours after you have filled those holes, that tells you your soils are not draining well, and that you need to apply water very slowly and less frequently, so that you're not keeping the root zones of your plants saturated, because that kills off not only the soil organisms, but it kills the plant roots as well. Your soil color is another kind of indicator of soil health, and particularly of how much organic matter is in it. The goal anywhere, typically when you're in terms of gardening, and especially for growing edibles or vegetable gardens, is to have a dark chocolate color. That indicates the right amount of organic matter. It's usually tilthy soil, whereas if you have gray or orange in your soil, that indicates other things going on. Orange soils are typical in clays, and just all it is a reflection of oxidization of iron in your soil, so that's not a bad thing. Whereas the gray could indicate anaerobic conditions, and I saw this particularly in Folsom, where they get these layers of what they call slickens, which are gray, this gray gooey clay layers that are left over from the old mining operations. So looking at a image of various soils, here you see these darker soils. There's not only the one that the arrow is pointing at, but you've got this and this as well. Those are nice colors to have. Oftentimes I know that in my area, I'm looking at native soil colors like this. If you live, you may be experiencing some of these others as well. So traditional soils tests really don't tell us a whole lot about the nutrient value of your soils. What it does is it tells you, because what it doesn't measure is the plant available nutrients. It just pretty much tells you the chemical makeup of your soils, and that may or may not be helpful. Most soils have some levels of nitrogen, potassium, and all the other different chemicals or nutrients that you want in a soil. But those soils tests, for the most part, are done for agricultural purposes. And it's not necessarily helpful for the home gardener, primarily because soil chemistry really does change throughout the year. And again, because they're not measuring plant available nutrients, adding more of those nutrients does not necessarily make any difference at all. Actually, it can start to compete with the ones you do need. Soil pH, however, is very important to know. For the most part, most of our soils are going to fall in this slightly acidic to slightly alkaline range. But if your soils are more to the acidic side or to the alkaline side, it can have a huge impact in how nutrients are absorbed. If you look at this graphic, you can see everything falling down between the slightly acidic and slightly alkaline. That's where most of the nutrients are absorbable by plants. When you start getting to the acid side or the alkaline side in terms of soil pH, now those nutrients, because they get tied up chemically, are not available to the plants themselves. So this is something that, in talking about the soil food web, it balances things out. And we'll talk, you'll get a little more detail here in a few minutes. So the typical gardening approach for most people, and I know me growing up even through the landscape profession, is to rototill, fertilize, water like crazy. In the fall, we're raking our leaves away. In the spring, we're spraying the weeds with herbicides and killing pests with insecticides. But the information most of us have really is oftentimes a blend of old wives' tales or anecdotal science or information from people selling products that they want to get out there and have us buy to, so to speak, fix our problems. And that really is kind of a very old-fashioned approach at this point in time. Again, if you just rely simply on traditional soil science, that's not enough to really understand the processes that are going on in your soil. This new approach, if we understand what's going on in your soil, it allows us to help manage that soil in a much more eco-friendly way. By letting the soil organisms do the work for us, we can become better gardeners and stewards, and there is far less work for us to do and better results. Traditionally, cultivating the soil is almost as old as modern man himself. But the way we do it these days really disconnects us from nature in terms of the whole rototilling, that whole process I mentioned in terms of the old way of doing things. Rototilling, fertilizing, using pesticides and herbicides. And when I say old, really often most of that started after World War I. So it's not so old. The way things were done in the past were much healthier for our soils, but even many civilizations have disappeared because they have absolutely cultivated their soils to death. So gardening with the soil food web really can help us reconnect with natural processes. And I'm here to tell you, I personally am experiencing it. We can reap the benefits of doing that with far less work. And it's amazing how, so most of us are familiar with the whole process of photosynthesis, energy hitting the leaves through photosynthesis. Carbon dioxide is produced, oxygen released, and photosynthates or carbon products, carbohydrates are produced. And then those are sent down into the roots, but they're also stored in the plants themselves. Those carbohydrates are what are referred to as exudates. Elaine Ingham refers to them as the cakes and cookies of the soils, because not only do the plant The plants themselves need these exudates to survive and for their metabolisms, but all these organisms in the soil share in these goodies, so to speak. They actually share back and forth in terms of organisms providing nutrients that are broken down for plants to absorb in trade for these carbohydrates or exudates. So the soil food web itself is comprised of all these microorganisms in the soil. This is a graphic from the USDA site that really shows you kind of how this works. And it starts with these various levels. It starts with the microorganisms in terms of the mycorrhizae and fungi and bacteria. The bacteria is like the most primitive organisms in the soil, but it's one of the things that there's the most of. And those bacteria are food for lots of all these other organisms in some form or another. Again, here's another graphic that really shows you kind of from the ground up. These are more macroorganisms. These are the ones that you can see with your naked eye. But they all work together in terms of affecting the soil itself and working to create this magnificent ecosystem. 1 teaspoon of healthy soil can contain 1 million to 1 billion bacteria, miles of fungal hyphae, and then all these other organisms. More organisms than people have ever lived on this planet, which is just amazing to think about. And the benefit of having a healthy soil food web is that it does reduce the need for fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, and fungicides. And those 4 items all greatly impact the health of your soil and not in a good way. It also will help improve the water and air holding capacity of your soil and result in typically healthier and more productive plants. And that's what we all want typically as gardens. Bottom line, we all garden because of the plants. So one of the things to just consider and think about, most of us have been to a forest, whether it's a broadleaf forest with lots of oaks and pines or whatever, or just pine forests. No one's ever fertilized those. They thrive through the system that they have evolved with and that they grow with. And when you think about it, all that material is falling to the forest floor, being integrated back into the soil, and then being taken up again as nutrients. And for the most part, most of our forests are relatively healthy. Now that they're getting overgrown, they're less so, but that's another topic. So anyway, gardening with the soil food web is a natural way to go. So this is showing kind of, again, the microorganisms, the bacteria, the fungi, the protozoa, and nematodes, most of which are not even visible to the naked eye. And they are generally more concentrated around the root zone of plants. And this is on the USDA site, but I mean, I'm not going to go over it because this presentation will be available both online in terms of the recording, and then I will also provide a PDF version of this that if you want to know more about this, you can refer to the documents. But these soil organisms that you cannot even see are really important in terms of what they do in the soil. They decompose manures and plant residues. Otherwise, we would just, who knows how deep everything would be if that didn't happen. They sequester nitrogen and other nutrients, and including carbon. They fix nitrogen and make it available to plants. They enhance aggregation and porosity of your soils, which help increase infiltration, but reduce runoff because you are getting the infiltration. And these organisms help keep pests in check. And it's a very convoluted in terms of how that all works, but they do help. The healthier your soil is, the less likely you're going to have pest problems in terms of disease and other organisms. And then they provide food for each other. They actually consume each other back and forth. They decompose, it on goes the cycle. So the greatest benefits of this soil food web are it really enhances soil fertility, which in turn increases the capacity to grow healthy plants. In one of the books I mentioned to you, The Soul of the Soil, it's through the activities of soil microbes, the basic raw materials needed by plants are made available at the right time, in the right form, and the right amount. It's amazing how plants send out signals to these microorganisms about what it needs, and vice versa. They end up, I mentioned before, they end up trading carbohydrates and the things that the microorganisms need, so that they both are benefiting from this relationship that they have. So microorganisms serve as nutrient facilitators and responsible for the formation of humus, as opposed to hummus, which is something you eat. So the soil fertility, really, again, that's what allows us to grow healthy plants and nurture those. And I think I forgot to remove a slide there. So ultimately, this whole cycle in the soil with microorganisms creates a poop loop, because these organisms, nothing goes in without having to go out. And so as they excrete or as they die and decompose, this organic matter that they're a part of in terms of the cycling gets broken down, redistributed, and then parts of it absorbed by plants. This just goes on and on and on. Carbon cycling, most of us are familiar with the concept of carbon footprints and talking about growing more forests and maintaining our forests for their carbon sequestration capabilities. And so the plants and the soils are main pools of carbon, both in terms of organic matter, organic carbon, and then the inorganic carbon, which is just simply minerals. So another benefit of healthy soils is helping to control disease. Most of the soil organisms are beneficial, but some of them are not. There are ones that are disease vectors as well, and can cause problems if the soil is not in the right balance. The nitrogen cycle is a natural cycle that occurs in the soils. One of the nice things about native plants is that native plants are adapted to low nitrogen soils, period. So one of the things we asked at the very beginning, we had you fill out the poll. The degree to which your soils, the type of gardening you do, will influence the type of soils and how much you want to work at this in terms of building your soils. Our gardens and edible gardens, whether you're doing fruit trees and other edible types of plants, asparagus, artichokes, those types of things, berries, that needs ongoing. The richer the soils in terms of having organic matter, the healthier those plants will be. Our vegetable gardens and again, that depends on whether you're doing raised beds or not, are also need richer soils. But our native gardens, we don't need to worry about that as much. But the soils, again, the soil food web, because of the way the nitrogen cycles works, that's very natural that most plants get the amount of nitrogen that they need. So I mentioned to you before, bacteria are the most numerous and the most basic of the soil organisms. And You'll find most of these organisms in what's called the rhizosphere, and that's that area right around the root zone of most plants. And in the presence of oxygen, they actually keep pathogenic bacteria in check so that they don't get out of control as long as conditions are right, and play an important role in breaking down toxins and pollutants. And again, very important in recycling. And almost all the soil organisms in somewhere actually consume bacteria. And bacteria happen to produce a biofilm that actually helps provide a protective barrier and a film around soil particles that helps hold them together and helps balance the pH in the area immediately around the root zone. So as long as you have healthy soils with the right kind of bacteria, that actually helps your situation and helps the health of your soil and your plants. When soils get out of balance and say watered too much or overly compacted, that allows anaerobic, that means without air, that type of bacteria, which is not healthy, to get a strength or a hold. And examples of those are Clostridium and E. coli, which we're all used to hearing in the news in terms of causing problems with various ag products. But so that's one of the things you do need to watch out for. And again, it's your gardening practices that can make or break that in terms of being worried about it. Fungi comes in all different kinds of forms. You can see all of these here. It's the primary agent that helps decay organic matter in the SFW, soil food web, breaking down the more difficult to break down parts of the plant material itself, like lignin and cellulose, take much longer time to break down. But it's so fungi is what does that. And then the chitin cells of insects and bones of animals, those obviously take much longer to break down and aren't as readily decomposable. And so they scout, actually fungi seeks that stuff out and then breaks it down and helps bind them up and then deliver them in another form to plants. So fungi can be decomposers, they're nutrient cyclers, they help build soil structure. Most of these soil organisms are beneficial symbionts. And then when I say a symbiont, it's like symbiotic relationships, and help prevent and cause, or can cause diseases, much fewer cause diseases. So most of the fungi, which are essentially mushrooms, reproduce by dispersing spores from their fruiting bodies. And the fruiting bodies are simply the part of the fungi that you see above ground. Not all fungi has that, but that's what these are when you see them. So mycorrhizae underground is like a very fine, finer than hairs, this system, and you'll see the next slide's got some photos, but they grow in association with the roots of plants. And boy, do they really help improve your soil and expand the root system capability of most plants. They grow out from the roots of plants, helping gather more nutrients and delivering those nutrients and more water to plants than their root systems alone would have access to. So the hyphae, which are each of these strands, grow end to end and just pretty much act like pipes in terms of moving materials in the soil. And in mass, it's referred to as mycelia or mycelium. So roughly 90 to 95% of plants have these associations with mycorrhizae in the soil. And you wonder probably why I'm telling you this. And it's because, again, your gardening practices can either enhance the mycorrhizae in your soil, which enhances the soil health, reducing the amount of water and nutrients that you need to provide. Or if you are rototilling and disturbing the soil a lot, you are probably minimizing the amount of mycorrhizae in your soil, which is just the opposite of what you want to do. So mycorrhizae can come in a different couple types, ectomycorrhizae, which grow on the outside of roots, or endomycorrhizae, which grow to the interior plants. Both of these are good, but they're especially needed for helping transport phosphorus and other types of minerals to plants. They help transport phosphorus, calcium, magnesium, iron, and copper. So again, this becomes part of the mechanism for self-fertilization, so to speak. Many of you, I know I see this on Facebook a lot. People will go, what is this growing in my yard? Especially they'll see it on tops of mounds of chips. If you're using mulches in your backyard or you're in your yard, oftentimes you'll see these slime molds mysteriously appear. And they're just fine. They are not harmful. Just know that they are there. And actually, it's an indication of a healthy soil underneath, and these organisms are there. They're pretty cool. Protozoa, again. Protozoa are really needed by earthworms in terms of having a good earthworm population. And again, these work in conjunction with the bacteria and fungi in a good soil food web. And this is where 80% of the nitrogen required by plants comes from protozoa poop. So we're talking about that poop loop again. And again, the worms need a healthy population of these organisms. Nematodes, there's good nematodes and bad nematodes. And nematodes resemble worms in that they're long and thread-like, but they're not actually worms themselves. Now, most of them you cannot even see with the naked eye, and others you may just, it may look like a moving hair on the ground. But they mineralize nutrients, and they do require a more porous soil to move through it, but most of them are beneficial and actually help keep root nematodes, which are not good, under control. And then we get to our macroorganisms, like all these arthropods. Most of us have seen these in our gardens, and they provide, they're a food source once they die, or their poop cycle helps provide more nutrients to the cycle, the microorganisms in the soil itself. But these are the guys who start the shredding of organic matter that then is taken by all the smaller, just keeps going down the line until you can't even recognize that organic matter in its original form eventually, and that's when it becomes humus. So both, we've got micro arthropods and macro arthropods. Our soil mites, again, major recyclers and decomposers, great indicator of soil health. Springtails, very tiny, you can see on the tips of this, and you may have think you see something when you're out gardening, and yes, you probably have, because again, you know, by the time you really see it, it's gone again. Yeah, it's not often that you will actually really notice these, but you might catch them. And again, they feed on bacteria and fungi as well. So as much as people really freak out about having termites and ants around your home, and for good reason, nobody wants them in their house or feeding on their house, but they provide a vital role in the soil itself. So if you have a larger property like I have, those termites are important to breaking down cellulose out in the forest areas. Whereas, yes, you don't want them anywhere near the foundation of your house, but they actually help move organic matter and organisms through the soil. And earthworms in particular are really fabulous to have in your soils. And if you have a lot of them, that's a great indicator of good soil health. They're master shredders. They aerate the soil and increase the porosity. Earthworm castings are earthworm poop, and they are just really high in nutrients. They really help increase the microbial population and overall fertility in your soils. So the vermicastings, or the earthworm poop, is roughly 50% higher in organic matter than in soil that does not have worms. That's because they're just constantly excreting this wonderful natural fertilizer, which is much richer in phosphate, potash, and nitrogen, and magnesium and calcium than the typical fertilizers. But this is all natural and stays bound up in the soil. It doesn't get washed out with rains and irrigation. And humus is something that, again, we all look to have in our soils. It's a characteristic or a component that most gardeners achieve to have, but really it's very hard to find because it is such typically a very thin layer on top of the soil, and it's where organic matter has just gotten to the right level of breakdown in terms of providing additional fertility to the soils. But anyway, it's one of those things that if you've got enough organic matter in your soils, you'll be fortunate enough to have a humus component in your soil. So the benefits of this soil food web is to provide us, to help control disease. And I mentioned to you before that not all soil organisms are beneficial, but having a substantial population of the good organisms helps keep the bad organisms under control. So that diversity really does help keep pathogens in check. And it'll greatly reduces the need for fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, and fungicides. I have never used fertilizers in my own gardening. And one of the things I can't just show it to you, but my fruit trees that I planted 2 years ago are off the charts for 2-year-old trees. And it's because of, I believe, how I've prepared my soil and how healthy the soil is. It really does improve the water and air holding capacity, which ends up resulting in healthier, more productive plants and reduces water usage. So the bacteria and fungi I mentioned before also produce this slime to help not only themselves be able to move around, but that slime actually ends up holding mineral particles together and allows these organisms to move through the soil even when there is a lot of water available. And then the fungal hyphae actually help physically bind these particles together as well, holding them together like a hairnet, so to speak. So the bacteria and fungi in your soil are the equivalent of fertilizer, whereas the protozoa and nematodes are equivalent to the fertilizer spreaders. They move the different minerals and that around and organic compounds that plants need, move that through the soil and other organisms as well. Oftentimes bacteria and other organisms are hitchhiking. Now, whether you are focused on having a tree, shrub, and perennials type garden versus veggies, annuals, and grasses, each one of those types of landscapes has a different balance of bacteria to mycorrhizal fungi in it. And also, so with trees and shrub areas, so think about woody plants. Woody plants are more fungal dominated. And so fungi ends up making the soils a little more acidic. Whereas the bacteria slimes, bacteria dominated soils tend to be more alkaline. And that goes toward, for the veggies, annuals, and grasses. And as I mentioned before, you saw the chart where pH itself very much affects how different compounds that plants need are affected. The uptake of those are affected by the pH of the soil. So just knowing that allows you to make better decisions about how you treat a woody plant dominated landscape versus your vegetable garden. They should be treated differently. So oftentimes it's really hard for people to kind of oftentimes move away from what they've always been doing, and using fertilizers is one of those things. But the effects of chemical fertilizers can really have a tremendous impact on the soil organisms themselves, because it reduces the production of plant available nitrogen. It interferes with the whole nitrogen cycle in the soil that would be natural there. It resulting in a reduction in the exudates or the carbohydrates that are being produced, that then attract all the soil organisms that are working to trade with the plant roots. And when that happens, then the microbe populations actually decline. And so oftentimes when people are using these fertilizers, it's like you start with a little bit and you have to start increasing it, because now you don't have the natural organisms in the soil doing the work for you. So it is really, if I could urge you to do anything, move away from the use of chemical fertilizers. If you need to use, especially in vegetable gardens, because we're always taking stuff out of those, we do need to use inorganic fertilizers often to supplement the nutrients that they need. But using organic fertilizers is a better way to go. Plus, you're going to have far fewer worms in areas that have chemical fertilizers put down, as opposed to organic, or just letting the soil food web work for you. So the chemical fertilizers not only deteriorate your soil structure, but they decrease the water holding capacity. These fertilizers are actually mineral salts. So the salts start increasing and building up in your soil. And then pathogens and pests tend to not be outcompeted, and now they're able to get out of control. If you're still rototilling, if you have already rototilled your garden once, that is enough. Now you need to simply put down layers of organic matter and let the soil organisms do the work for you. Rototilling itself breaks up that good fungal hyphae that you really want to be promoting. It destroys worms in those populations, and really destroys and impacts negatively the other organisms in the soil. And eventually it reduces the air and water holding capacity, because by its very nature, it's compacting your soils. So to build healthy soils, this is letting the whole feedback loop, the whole soil organisms, the soil food web loop work for you, will help build your soils back up. So the proper care and feeding of soil organisms does demand close attention to managing those. And you can do this through three primary strategies: building and maintaining humus or organic matter, composting, and mulching. And those are fairly easy to do. You can always improve your soil structure and the nutrient availability and soil retention and the water holding capacity, no matter what type of soil you do have. Letting the soil food web do it for you will have great benefits. So the steps you can take to improve your soil involve using compost, mulching your soil, possibly the use of compost tea, encouraging mycorrhizal fungi growing in your soil. And I will talk about the use of other amendments or not. So compost is great. Typically, oftentimes it's just, compost is any organic matter that is breaking down. But to compost properly, if you're going to compost yourself, there is an art to it, to getting the right balance. So you can also buy compost in bags, or you can compost yourself. And I would urge you to take a master gardener class in doing it if you do not know how, or look it up on the internet. And I would encourage you to go to the UCANR site, which is University of California Agricultural and Natural Resources, to learn how to properly compost. Sometimes some of the information online can get a little out there and maybe not be so accurate. But what it really does, what compost does for you, is to help build up the soil organisms. It really increases the populations of those. You don't want any herbicides, pesticides, or fungicides. So if you're using things like horse manure, oftentimes horse owners are giving their horses worm medications to deworm them. So you want to make sure that stuff is all really well composted, and so that all of that is out of there. You don't want to be putting something down that's going to be harming the organisms in your soil. So if you're starting a new landscape and it's not a native landscape, getting a lot of organic matter into your soil, and this is particularly great for vegetable gardens or orchards, that type of thing, is incorporating roughly 12 cubic yards per 1,000 square feet of good quality compost, and getting that mixed into roughly a foot deep if you can. And then on an annual basis, you only need to place roughly a 1/4 inch to an inch of compost around the plants, on the ground, on top of the ground, and the organisms, especially the earthworms, will take that and start pulling that down into the soil and incorporating it. Animal manures, some of them need to be composted, some of them are fine to use straight. Things like llama poo or rabbit pellets can be used straight. Horse manure, steer manure, chicken manures, all of those need to be aged at least 6 months because otherwise they're just too hot in terms of nitrogen and will actually damage your plants and the organisms as well. Grain manures are another way to go. So any crop that's chopped and dropped before it goes to bloom, you can put these, and I'm trying to think of the name of the, all of a sudden the name has gone out of my head in terms of the online, hopefully I have it, nursery up out of Grass Valley. A lot of different nursery sites offer green manures and different combinations of them depending on what you want to achieve, where you plant these seeds, let them grow, and then before they've gone to seed, just cut them down and let them get incorporated into the soil naturally. It really can help break up compacted soils after time and help enrich the soil, and especially increase the biomass of the organisms in the soil. Cover crops are beneficial in a lot of different ways. They help suppress weed growth. Again, it's something you can just let grow, but those having more variety of roots around in your planter beds, and especially with your in vegetable beds, actually increases the greater diversity of plant roots in a particular area. You'll generally have a richer population of soil organisms in there as well. So you want to use cover crops underneath other plants, like under your berries, under your orchard trees. This is a great place. Or in your beds if you have raised beds with your vegetables. Co-planting, one of the benefits besides soil improvement is that they attract and feed beneficial insects, which can be pollinators or natural enemies of pests that actually feed, things like aphids. So this helps attract and feed the beneficial insects. And it helps shade the soil, which helps maintain the moisture in the soil and reduce the need for irrigation. Once you're done with your plantings, you want to make sure to keep the ground covered. You want very, very little bare soil exposed, particularly right around your plants. So using organic mulches like wood chips. Now, wood chips will help promote the mycorrhizal type soil, and so will leaves and pine needles. Now, if you're in a fire-prone area, you don't want pine needles at all, unless you have got those out well away from anything any structures. Like if you've got vegetable beds that are out 300, at least 50 feet beyond your own structures, you could use pine needles in that, but just know that those will be the first probably to burn should flying embers start. Grass clippings is great if you have grass clippings that can't be used anywhere else, and straw. So something down on the soil. And the reason I say to leave very little soil bare is that our native pollinators, the majority of them do need bare soil for nesting sites. So you need to leave a little bit. So each 1% of organic matter that you add to the soil increases or helps the soil hold 20,000 gallons more water per acre. So you can see how that really matters in terms of needing less water to apply less water to your soil. Without that soil organic matter, there's nothing there to help hold it in the soil. This is a before and after picture of mulch, bare dirt around your plantings versus after. So really, those mulches help reduce evaporation. They do prevent weed growth, makes weeds much easier to pull, and it insulates roots from the heat. Again, making it so that you need less water. The mulch also provides a home for beneficial organisms. And you roughly, depending again on whether you live in a fire-prone area or not, you want to place, if you live in a fire-prone area, you only want 1 to 2 inches of mulch placed down. But if you have the ability and you're not in a fire-prone area, going 3 to 4 inches thick is great. Just make sure you taper mulch away from the stems and trunks of your plant material so it doesn't start rotting. Compost tea can be a very controversial component of using, trying to encourage or enhance your soil organisms, simply because the UC system doesn't like us typically to talk about it because you can't replicate. Compost, every batch of compost is different, so it's very difficult for them to research something like this. But there's been a lot of evidence that compost tea can benefit the microbiology in the soil or on plants. So it is something you can try. For the most part, it's never been shown to be harmful. I won't say never, but done properly, it is something that you might want to consider using. Landscape fabrics, the good and the bad. I only use landscape fabrics under my gravel walkways. It winds up that these synthetic fabrics really interfere with the whole process of organic matter getting down into the soil and the soil organisms interacting with the surface, both with air, water, and organic matter. So I would really encourage you not to be using landscape fabrics. The compost or mulch will actually be much better for all of your plant materials. And it winds up, because you don't have that organic matter and this activity going on at the surface level, eventually the soil becomes more compacted around your plants when you are using landscape fabric. So definitely not something, a characteristic you want to encourage. So there's a number of different ways you can improve your soil. I mentioned before, a one-time rototilling a lot of compost into your soil is one way to go. Sheet mulching is another, and especially if you're trying to do something like removing lawn. And it's as simple as putting down newspaper and cardboard and then topping it with 8 to 12 inches of mulch, compost and or mulch. This is a great graphic that was created by Toby Hemingway, who really great permaculturist. But you can see he's got just numbers and numbers of layers of different types of organic matter layered in there. Once you put this down and let it start to sit for a couple of months, what happens to the soil underneath it is really quite nothing short of a miracle. But some of the nutrients or materials that are oftentimes encouraged by, if you go into nurseries or some of the permaculture enthusiasts, will encourage you to buy mineral nutrients to supposedly replace those removed by harvesting crops. You want to be careful about buying into some of this stuff. For the most part, your soil has enough mineral nutrients there for eons, unless you are just constantly taking organic matter out and never supplementing it back with compost. The rock powders, you know, again, the minerals in those powders are already in your soil. You probably don't need them. Biochar, research shows that it's best used in the composting process because it helps provide hiding places for microorganisms, but it by itself really does not do much for the soil itself. It can probably help break it up a little bit, especially if you have denser soils, but it doesn't do much by itself to change the characteristics in a positive way for your soils. So I'm on the last couple of slides. So this is just in the springtime. What you want to look at doing is getting your compost piles cooking. Mine are cooking all year round. I have a tumbler I love to use, and apply that compost in the spring around your plants, 1/4 inch to 1 inch thick. Again, taper it away from your trunks. Don't let it build up there. And the soil organisms will take that and bring it into the soil itself. In the summertime, you want to look at possibly compost your using the green mulch, whether it's fresh grass clippings or you're cutting down the manure crops, and just letting it sit will help, again, just continue to build your soils. And then any mulches that you're using, keep those up as well. In the fall is when you usually want to plant your green mulches. And actually, I don't encourage gathering up and storing leaves unless you need them off of a lawn or some other area. Fallen leaves are a huge protector for pollinator larvae. So you really don't want to disturb fallen leaves any more than necessary. Where I live, I do blow the leaves off of my walkways under my oak trees, because those oak trees need as thick a mulch as they can possibly get. Plus those leaves are the fertilizer, so to speak. They're what break down and provide the nutrients for my trees, the oak trees' health. There are some microbial organic foods that can boost the populations of organisms, including soybean meal. What this is it's essentially simple carbohydrates. Getting those into the soil can help boost the populations a little bit and help you get a start. And then in the winter, great time to read a good garden books and articles about gardening. So again, let that soil food web work for you. Think about how nature works. And if you try to embrace that and incorporate that, you'll find yourself with a better, healthier soils, healthier plants, the need to use far less water, and hopefully enjoying the whole gardening process. So with that, and for more information, here's the contact information for the Citrus Heights Water District, where you can also sign up for additional classes and find the links for the webinars and handouts.
Thank you so much, Kit. Would you mind reading through these questions here when we'll maybe just take a minute or so to wrap them up?
Okay, let's see. Now let me get my, trying to get my, up, there we go. Got my cursor back over onto the right page. When you use two screens, it's okay. 10 minutes left. Let's see.
Do you want me to go ahead and read them to you? I'm looking at the Q&A section.
Okay, so I'm a UC Master Gardener who joined to get a refresher on my soils. This is really helping me. Great.
The question and answer section, it's different from the chat.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, there we go. Just a couple of notes. Let me check more than one box. Okay, so I mentioned on the whole thing is that the soils for native plants, if you are a native plant enthusiast as I am, there is far less need to do anything with your soils unless you have no topsoil at all, because oftentimes when suburbs are developed or new housing developments, all the topsoil has been removed and that. So you may need to do something like do sheet mulching just to get a little more organic matter back into and encourage more microorganisms to get into your soil before you plant. So doing that a good year ahead of time is great. Thought today we were learning how to compost. No, I would imagine that they probably, do you have, typically, Rebecca, do you guys offer a composting class?
We haven't before. It's sometimes brought up in other soils classes, but that's something we can certainly look into for the future. Yeah,
okay. And I would encourage you to also take a look at your local Master Gardener programs, because they often do that. It's one of the more common. What are your thoughts about eating soil? No, I wouldn't encourage that. It's not like you have to wash everything, but actually we do encourage you bring your vegetables in, you rinse them off, just to make sure that any bacteria that you don't want, things like E. coli, are not on those. But eating soil itself, I would not encourage. And so don't turn over the soil with a shovel. Well, when you're going to plant a new plant, it's necessary to dig out a hole and to do that. So no, but otherwise, if you're just turning soil to loosen it up, in that, I would encourage you not to do that. I don't know why you would be, I don't know if you're just trying to loosen your soil or what the purpose is in it, but just to do it, I would encourage you not to. I would encourage you to put down mulch or compost over that soil. Put compost, then put mulch over it, because then things are going to the organisms are going to start bringing that organic matter down into the soil and loosening it up for you. Let them do the work. So I think I covered those.
There seems to be one more question, Kit, from Philip in the chat, who's asking, the street manure that I stored over the winter is infested with mites and flight bugs. How can I clean it and use it?
If you are composting, I would encourage you to throw it all into your compost pile and keep it stirred up. There's probably nothing wrong with it. Turn it and let it, and you need to water it a little bit, not so it's soggy, but so that it's a little bit moist. and just keep turning it. If I had a lot of steer manure, I'd probably be letting my chickens run through it to get out a lot of those insects, especially the mites and the flying bugs while they're still in their larval stages. But the steer manure, if you've had it stored for a long time, I wouldn't worry about it. I'd go ahead and just incorporate it. You know, let it maybe turn it a few times and then incorporate it or spread it out. I don't know if you're planning on, usually you wouldn't apply steer manure to a traditional landscape, but I assume that perhaps you're using it for a vegetable garden. So.
Thank you, Kit. We're out of time, so we're not going to be answering any more questions today. But again, the presentation and video will be available on our website soon, and everybody who registered for the class will also get an email with the link to that page. And thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and visit our website, chwd.org, for additional information about our rebates and programs. And you can also see all of our past Water Smart classes there as well.